So I'm very pleased that Lucas is here, and you've had a chance to read his background on this green sheet, and his topic he's chosen is Love, the Politics of Identity, and the Future of FOR. So thank you, Lucas, for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. You know, Rose, thank you for that. And, you know, several of you have heard me allude to this fact, and it's probably referenced in my bio. I can't remember, but I have the privilege of representing FOR on the National Council. And one of the other privileges that I have, being and living and working and doing the kind of work that I do in Atlanta, I have the privilege of interacting with a lot of my elders from the, you know, I said yesterday, the movement for the expansion of American democracy, or the Southern freedom struggle, anything but the civil rights movement, right? Because that's too narrow a term to describe all that people went through then and all that people were working for. And so one of the great privileges for me is that when I'm with my elders, these African Americans who put their lives on the line during the Southern Freedom Movement, and I show up and I say, I represent the Fellowship of Reconciliation. There's a pause, there's often a smile, and there's often a pause and a smile and a response, I haven't heard those words in a very long time. Okay. Unless I'm mistaken, you know, Rose mentioned that she wanted an African American from the National Council. Unless I'm mistaken, I am the African American on the National Council. So your options weren't very many. Although I do think sometimes I have multiple personalities, so I don't know which one you're getting today. And so, but it is an honor and a privilege to represent a movement that is still more diverse than we often see, right? I often say to folks that I encounter, they say, I used to be a member of FOR. And I say, well, you still are. Unless, of course, you've renounced nonviolence, or unless which is certainly not the case for the people I'm interacting with. I want to talk a little bit more about my life and my own journey to help maybe provide a little bit of encouragement for the work that we have ahead. But Rose mentioned someone, a great elder in FOR, Howard Thurman, who's someone I think that's been so profoundly important to so many of us, and so profoundly important to FOR. Other than A.J. Musty, Howard Thurman was probably the most FOR identified person in the country, and we often don't honor that. We don't talk about that. That's not known. But when Howard Thurman went to India, Ceylon, and Burma, and Gandhi, and met with Mahatma Gandhi, and Gandhi said to him, it may be through the American Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will make it to the world. Howard Thurman was long a member of FOR by that point. Anyway, I won't say too much more about him, but what I'd like to do, so this year I had the privilege of teaching at Morehouse College with Dr. Harding, with Vincent Harding, a class that was titled The Last Years of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and the Expansion of American Democracy. And it was a beautiful experience to work with my young Morehouse brothers, and to teach a part of American history that is undertaught, if taught at all. And but there were two things that made me think, you know, I had some remarks prepared that didn't necessarily include what I'm about to play for you now. But Laurie Childers kept kind of reminding me of our class this semester at Morehouse. Because every class period we began with the song that Laurie played for you earlier called Ella's Song. We who believe in freedom cannot rest, right? And I'm going to ask Laurie to sing it in the end, at the end of my remarks here. But I kept thinking maybe it's appropriate to invite you all into the class that we had, right? As the initial portion of my remarks here. And in order to do that, I thought that the most appropriate way, other than to begin with Ella's Song, is to begin with the other thing that we began with. And those were these words from Howard Thurman.
No man is. Martin Luther King Jr. is dead. This is the simple and utter fact. A few brief hours ago, his voice could be heard in the land, from the ends of the earth, from the hearts of our cities, from the firesides of the humble and the mighty, from the cells of 1,000 prisons, from the deep central place in the soul of America, the cry of anguish can be heard. There are no words with which to eulogize this man. Martin Luther King was the living epitome of a way of life that rejected physical violence as the lifestyle of a morally responsible people. His assassination reveals the cleft deep in the psyche of the American people, the profound ambivalence and ambiguity of our way of life. Something deep within us rejects nonviolent direct action as a dependable procedure for effecting social change. And yet, against this rejection, something always struggles, pushing, always pushing, with another imperative, another demand. It was King's fact that gave to this rejection flesh and blood, courage and vision, hope and enthusiasm. For indeed in him the informed conscience of the country became articulate. And tonight, what many of us are feeling is that we, all of us, must be that conscience wherever we are living, wherever we are functioning, and wherever we are behaving. Perhaps his greatest contribution to our time and to the creative process of American society is not to be found in his amazing charismatic power over masses of people, nor is it to be found in his peculiar and challenging courage with its power to transform the fear-ridden black men and women with a strange new valor, nor is it to be found in the gauntlet which he threw down to challenge the inequities and brutalities of a not quite human people, but rather in something else. Always he spoke from within the context of his religious experience, giving voice to an ethical insight which sprang out of his profound brooding over the meaning of his Judeo-Christian heritage. And this, indeed, is his great contribution to our time. He was able to put at the center of his own personal religious experience a searching ethical awareness. Thus, organized religion as we know it in our society found itself with its back against the wall. To condemn him, to reject him, was to reject the ethical insight of the faith it proclaimed. And this was new. Racial prejudice, segregation, discrimination were not regarded by him as merely un-American, undemocratic, but as mortal sin against God. For those who are religious, it awakens guilt. For those who are merely superstitious, it inspires fear. And it was this fear that pulled the trigger of the assassin's gun that took his life. Tonight there is a vast temptation to strike out in pain, horror, and anger. Riding just under the surface are all the pent-up furies, the accumulation of generations of cruelty and brutality. A way must be found to honor our feelings without dishonoring him whose sudden and meaningless end has called them forth. May we harness the energy of our bitterness and make it available to the unfinished work which Martin has left behind. It may be, it just may be, that what he was unable to bring to pass in his life can be achieved by the act of his dying. For this, there is eloquent precedence in human history. He was killed in one sense because mankind is not human yet. May he live because all of us in America are closer to becoming human than we ever were before. I express my deep compassion for his wife, his children, and his mother, his father, and his brother. May we all remember that the time and the place of a man's life on the earth are the time and the place of his body. But the meaning of his life is as vast, as creative, and as redemptive as his gifts, his time, and the passionate commitment of all his powers can make it. Our words are ended, and for a long, waiting moment, the rest is silence.
Powerful, huh? There's a tradition that I try to honor, especially after hearing something like that. I'm still a young man, and I feel like I have to ask my elders for permission to speak, and so I see permission. So I was born 13 years after the assassination of Dr. King. And the very same year that that great mystic teacher and FOR leader Howard Thurman died. My father was in the US Army, and he, my mother, and my two older siblings were living in Erlangen, Deutschland. My earliest years were incredibly rich with all the diversity that life in the US Army often represents. My childhood friends were black, white, Puerto Rican, Korean. My favorite things to do was to watch the German teenagers play soccer and eat Gummibärchen, gummy bears. Right? And to watch my older sister skateboard and graffiti. Where are my artists that were here earlier referencing graffiti? We American Army kids were stationed abroad were really experiencing, for whatever the U.S. Army is, or also is, it in many ways is also America's great experiment in socialist meritocracy. We were far away from the urban ghettos and rural poverty or the other harsh realities that our parents knew. My parents had grown up in segregated North Florida. They knew the bitter realities of American racism. They fought to integrate their public schools and resisted social, economic, and physical intimidation of segregationist whites. I knew their experiences, but they seemed remote from my consciousness as a child. And this was, of course, by my parents' very design. But when I was 8 years old, well, actually, this is kind of an anecdotal story. When I was 8 years old, we decided to leave the Germany for the United States, where my dad would be stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia. Now you can imagine the transition. But before we leave, I have this anecdotal story that I like to tell about my last memorable trip in Germany. I was a little boy, and we went to go visit the Soviet side, and we went to the Berlin Wall. And the East German soldiers detained my father, and I was angry, and I kicked the wall. And I like to say that I started the revolution. Well, but when we returned to the U.S., the integration that I had experienced on army bases in Germany would come crashing to an end. And I was engulfed in the broader realities of U.S. culture. There were race riots at the high school where my brother and sister attended. It was the 90s, and for the first time in my life, I was called. The white kids refused to let me play G.I. Joe, which maybe was a good thing in the end. I think what made things also difficult was the fact that the way I dressed and spoke, the hallmarks of my middle-class upbringing, prompted the other black kids to call me an Uncle Tom and a sellout. My brother and sister and I's habits were emphatically declared not things that black people do. It was a confusing and tumultuous time for me, and I didn't know where to direct my anger. I couldn't hate all white people. That would require me to hate one of my childhood best friends, Wesley, and his whole family. I certainly couldn't hate all black people. That would require me to hate my family and many of my friends, and most importantly, myself. I didn't have the sophisticated tools to deconstruct racism and internalized racism. I couldn't escape this feeling that I was being asked to choose sides in a war that had started long before I ever arrived. Now, before I left Germany, I'd been baptized in a small Baptist church that catered to the families of soldiers. And I was convinced that Jesus would have nothing to do with this. Now, I knew Jesus was real because of the way my grandmother spoke about him. And Grandma often reminded me, despite her battles with Klansmen and all manner of racism, that God did not desire hatred, but love. Now, at this point, I should also explain the irony of being raised in between traditions. I was profoundly influenced by the powerful spiritual and freedom-loving tradition of my grandmother's African Methodist Episcopal Church. My grandfather was a progressive National Baptist pastor, the denomination that was started by Dr. King. But I was also raised in predominantly white Southern Baptist Christian churches. And I had an image of two very different types of gods. One God was really concerned about justice here on earth. That was my grandmother's God. I didn't like it when people were mistreated. The other God was much more interested in who had sex with who. My pastor, the Southern Baptist pastor, would sometimes preach about the good old days, and my dad would lean over and kind of nudge me and say those days were good for some folks. And then, as if it wasn't sort of difficult enough to navigate this tension between, with being one of America's black children, I also had to come to the terms with the fact that, by my adolescent years, it was at this point undeniable that I was what they call a homosexual. And yes, I was told that being gay was in conflict with both my blackness and my Christianity. And I faced another seemingly irreconcilable difference. Eventually, one thing that I'll credit with my evangelical Southern Baptist roots for is that they did teach me how to pray. And eventually, in time, I realized that Jesus wasn't really concerned about that either. And I began to reject the absurdity of the choice between my sexuality, my faith, and my racial solidarity. Yeah, hallelujah. And thank God I eventually also found those living witnesses and facts of our existence in the world, those saints like James Baldwin and Bayard Rustin. Yes. And I saw thousands of resilient and beautiful examples of our not at all hypothetical fact in Atlanta. So I tell you all this to say this, that I spent a great number of my early years as a fragmented self. Different parts of me at conflict with each other, at war with each other. I think America encourages a kind of schizophrenic existence, especially among people of color, especially among women, among anyone who's not a part of the dominant culture. And so by the time I eventually showed up at Ethan Vesely Fladd's door in Harlem, New York, my first formal identification with FOR, I had already known something about reconciliation. The tragic consequences of racism, homophobia, and sexism causes us to go to war with ourselves, and my refusal to do that was my first conscientious objection. It was my refusal to be drafted. The principle of reconciliation that is often needed, in my opinion, is sometimes, the principle of reconciliation is sometimes an internal reconciliation, right? It's the inward journey that's necessary for us to be true witnesses in the world. And I think that our task within FOR, our opportunity within FOR, is often to help remember, to help people understand that they are one whole in and within themselves, but into a part of a whole beyond themselves. That's what the civil rights movement did. It confronted America with the truth about its existence as a schizophrenic society, as a disjointed and confused society. That's what we still have to do. Times are not that different. I'm often reminded of the uncomfortable words that express this the most clearly. I have no idea what I'm doing with these papers. They're words by James Baldwin. And he delivered them at Kalamazoo College in 1960. And he says, "Love does not begin and end the way we think it does. Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is growing up. No one in the world, in the entire world, knows more, knows Americans better, or odd as this may sound, loves them more than the American Negro. This is because he has had to watch you, outwit you, bear you, and sometimes even bleed and die with you since we got here. That is, since both of us got here, black and white. And whether you like it or not, or whether I like it or not, we are bound together forever. We are a part of each other. What is happening to every Negro in the country at any time is also happening to you. And this is a wedding. There's no way around this. And so I'm suggesting that these walls, these artificial walls which have been up so long to protect us from something we fear, must come down. And so Washington and Seattle, and Oregon, whatever is happening to any Negro anywhere in this country is also happening to you. Whatever is happening to any gay and lesbian person anywhere in this country is also happening to you. Whatever is happening to any person of color, to any immigrant, to any person experiencing joblessness, to the people who are not homeless, but people experiencing homelessness, whatever is happening to them is also happening to you. Thank you for knowing that. Thank you for your work to heal yourselves, to reconcile your community. Because we can't challenge the militarism, the war, the aggression anywhere else in the world as fragmented as we are. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Lori, would you sing for us?
Thank you, Lucas. That was wonderful. It's always interesting to sing when you're crying, so I'm going to need your help. And this is cool because we actually already had some practice on this one, huh?
Do you want me to sing with you?
Sure. Sure. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. That which touches me most is that I had a chance to work with people, passing on to others that which was passed on to me. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light as they carry us through the gale, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to carry us through the storm. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me. I need to be one in a number as we stand against tyranny. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand and fight is the only way my struggle survives. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. No, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Bye. This is the joy part. These broad shoulders.
Questions? Yes.
So what? What can we do? How can FOR really change?
It does. It really does. But you've got to be relevant. You know, I can't ignore things like mass incarceration, right? I mean, you know, I experience it every time I realize how few of my peers there are in the spaces that I travel in, right? I mean, it's me who's locked up, and you've got to be relevant to that. Yes.
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Please.
I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia.
Amen.
And when you were telling your story, the pain was so bad for me that it's like, I'm glad you could bring the whole circle around and close with healing, because those memories are so painful.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, look, she was sharing her experience growing up in Atlanta, and she said that she remembered the pain and was thankful that I could close in healing.
What is your day-to-day assignment with FOR?
That's an interesting question. So I'm not on staff at FOR. No. So I serve on the National Council, and I serve on the International Committee of the International FOR. And so my day-to-day work within FOR has been kind of what I decide that it is as a volunteer within the movement. But I serve on the Task Force for Latin America and the Caribbean, right? And program and membership with Lori. And as far as my work with TFLAC is concerned, I'm very interested in connecting the drug war on both sides, right? Because I see the drug war as a veiled and racist, whatever we want to call it, something. Only unpleasant words come to my mind. So, so for me, the mass incarceration of black and brown young men and women in this country is intimately connected to the tragedy in Mexico and the tragedy in Colombia. So.
You mentioned the feeling of schizophrenia and the pain of having to, being asked to join in the wars against your people, your sexuality. Rest assured that white guys have had several hard things tossed at us. Like in my lifetime, I was raised as a Catholic. I was the altar boy and all this stuff. But during the period when I was in early teens, I was hurt by the war in Vietnam and how the church supported the war. And all of us little kids knew that this was wrong. And so we were basically, it was damaging. It was painful to feel that. And actually I split away and I haven't been inside a church in 40 years except to listen to peace and justice talks. But now in 2000, actually I entered secular society, because what else is there, Rationalism, science, and so we said, okay, we'll put a man on the moon and all this stuff. Remember that? So anyway, that became my identity. I became an accountant. And then in 2003, I was handed another really painful thing. When my country attacked Iraq, and I haven't been able to deal with that. I don't know what to do with that, so I just don't do anything. I refuse to do anything. I can't be a part of my country. I'm not on board with the American project anymore.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
Well, let me.
I take videos of people who can talk without breaking down in tears.
And let me say this. I did not mean, when I was talking about people of color and the experience of being a black American, I didn't mean that to exclude the poison, the toll that race is a construct, right? And it's something that's poisonous for all of us, and the American system is dependent on lying to white men and having white men believe it. And when white men don't, it's hard. It's hard. And so I acknowledge that. The other thing I wanted to say, because I'm also an advocate for mental health, and have friends that deal with schizophrenia, I was reluctant to use schizophrenia in that way. And so I did, because I felt like it was a graphic illustration of, untreated schizophrenia looks like the American experience, but I did not want to contribute to the stigmatizations of schizophrenics. So please let me say that. Yes, ma'am.
So you're here.
Yes, ma'am.
And you've come before. So glad that you can join us again. What is it going to take to bring more African Americans, to bring more young people to this organization? What is the link that FOR has with the bigger world, given its mission, and given that at least in this small room here, there are so few young people, there are so few homeless people, there are so few African Americans?
Well, you remember that point when I talked about my own conscientious objection? And of course, I could have told that story. I could have told the story of refusing to go into the economic draft, right? Or refusing to join the army because I needed a job. Like, I could have told a story of expressing my conscience in many different ways. But I told that story in part because I think that one of the things that happens within FOR is that we look for the familiar patterns to be able to say, oh, you're in. Your story sounds like mine enough to where I can trust you, right? And we ain't gonna get better if we keep doing that. I mean, like, in other words, you have to be able to look for, we don't get to define the character of resistance. We get to recognize it, right, when we see it. And I think that's one of the things that has to happen. I think, somewhere in Portland or in Corvallis, there is probably, imagine this, there's a community of African Americans struggling against economic exploitation or somewhere, and they're wondering, where are these FOR people? How can we get them to, they're asking the same question on the other side, right? So in other words, be present. And also, I am a Southerner, so I say sir and ma'am by default, and I do not mean it is not right. But my dad wasn't that kind of military man. But so I do not mean, when I say ma'am, it's not me trying to be sexist, all right? So, or subservient. I'm not trying to. That's what I do. And y'all are my elders, most of y'all anyway. Okay. Well, for all the way in the back first, sir, in the green, yes.
I just want to echo what you said about, kind of being open to other people's different perspectives. I went and dropped in on a little conversation last night with a couple of our doctor friends. Kind of share a little my experience, and then they immediately left. I felt kind of like, it's not me really, but kind of felt like that. But, I'm not good at this either, but I think the kernel is to respect people, no matter who they are. And that's kind of like the basis of it.
I saw a hand somewhere in the middle here. Bert? Was it? Yes, sir.
That's me. Call me sir if you want. began with Professor Thurman's comments about Martin Luther King, I have a need to say something. It's relevant to the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's a little anecdote I begin with. I've been reading Gandhi's biography by Narayan Desai, and I went to hear a man who had been the executive editor of the New York Times, Joseph Lillyville, who'd written a book on Gandhi at Town Hall in Seattle. And I got there early and I got to talk to him. And I said to him, here's a book by Jim Douglas that he didn't know about. I printed out the page from Amazon so he could read it. And Jim believes that Gandhi was assassinated.
Well, he believes both of them
And
were
Gandhi,
assassinated.
Jim Douglas wrote a book about Gandhi called Gandhi and the Unspeakable.
Right.
And Jim believes and has a lot of evidence that Gandhi was killed by conspiracy, not by a lone gunman.
Yes.
I said to him, that's just like the trial of the assassination, the conclusion of the trial of the assassination of Martin Luther King.
The Memphis trials.
Exactly, exactly. And so I was stunned by this man who was the executive editor of the New York Times for a decade, including 1999 when this trial of the century took place, and he didn't know about it. I don't believe he was putting me on. So I think there may be people here who don't know that there was a trial in Memphis that took 3.5 weeks, 70 witnesses, and came to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King involving, quote, governmental agencies. So I want to recommend to people, if they don't know this, the King Center has the transcript of that trial. You can read that conclusion. But better and easier, maybe, is to read Jim Douglas's comments about sitting through the entire trial. And one place I know you can read it is through streetspirit.org, which is a street newspaper in San Francisco, and put Jim Douglas or Kennedy King trial in the search engine. You can read about it, or come see me and I can give you a fuller URL and tell you more about it. But it's something I think it's important for us to know what really is happening in the country. And that's part of it.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, everyone that I know that was around Dr. King during that time did not accept that a lone gunman killed him.
What you do there, and also what your experience has been like working.
Could you repeat the question?
She wanted to know what my work has been like at the King Center and what I do there, and want to know what my experience has been. And let me just say that I was a contract employee with a particular project called the King Center Imaging Project. And what we did is we went through the digitized archives of the King Center. I mean, on one hand, the project was digitizing the archives, so scanning them, so on and so forth. I don't say scan because they would get really offended. A glorified scan of the archives. And then my job was I worked with a team of civil rights scholars to help sort through the content and write content and that might help make the archives that are now accessible online more accessible to the public. So that was my work. I don't know if you were intending to, if you were going there or leading me to respond to this particular topic, but that was during the time that Martin III was the president and CEO of the King Center. It is now Bernice King. And if it's in reference to Bernice King's rather homophobic record, I didn't engage her or that. I was there during the time of Martin III. And interestingly enough, you know, ever since the whole Eddie Wong scandal, I don't know if you guys know about that, yeah, but ever since then, Bernice seems to be not as vocal about her homophobia. And in fact, she made a very inclusive statement in Atlanta when she took over that said she actually included gay and lesbian folks in her list of all people being welcome at the King Center. So, you know, I see that as a very positive turn of events.
Just quickly, Martha's question about engaging other groups with this group, and this group is largely white.
Oh, beautiful.
I was told one time that if you want to engage other groups, be it youth or black or Hispanic or whatever, you have to not wait for them to come to you. You have to go to them. And when you go to them, you're going to find yourself outside your comfort zone. And you're going to feel like, this is hard to do. Well, do it.
But I will say this, and this is something that I might not even need to repeat in this room because of, you know, the amazing people that you are. But one of the things that also means is do your homework, right? Do not busy people with their backs against the wall with teaching you about their oppression. Yeah. Don't do that.
Right.
Don't do that because you know, I get tired. You know, I can't deal with y'all right now. I have my own stuff. So take seriously that responsibility to know what's happening in those communities. I mean, you know, and it's not, at this point, I mean, it's not, you know, racism is, it's not just a black-white thing, especially in this part of the country. I know that. It's one of the things that makes me so reticent to speak about racism here, because it's a much more diverse part of the country, right? And the history with, you know, sort of the exploitation of Asian peoples, the exploitation of South Asian folks. I mean, it's a much more complicated dynamic, and all of that needs to be understood. But of course, the structural violence that racism is the same across the country.
I guess I have the same type of thing that he talked about, and I guess I want to challenge every one of you to go alone to some black event, some black church, and participate. Don't go there to learn, to teach. Go there to just be there as one single white person so that you can experience what it's like to be a minority. Experience that. And believe me, the fear that you have to confront to go alone is just huge. It's huge. But I challenge every one of you, when I come back here next year, I want to hear from you that you've gone alone outside your fear and your comfort zone to participate, not to lead, not to learn, not to teach, but to participate in black events or black churches.
For some of you who live outside of an urban area, Willamette Valley, I'm talking to you, that might be a little hard, but one place that might do something like that is the Hispanic community. That is probably the minority in our area that is far less welcome than black people.
Or talk to young active duty military men. That's really hard. I can easily go and join in cross racial groupings, but not bases. That's the hard one for me.
Yes.
So thank you again. I think it was really powerful to hear you speak, and it was really powerful. Thank you for sharing your personal story about what it has meant to you, like your own experience with reconciliation of your identity. And I'm wondering, we've had some discussions about what reconciliation really means. Does it mean in the wake of Occupy, or in the middle of Occupy, that we should be promoting goodwill among people of all classes and be like, yay, like we're the 99%, you're the 1%, let's sit down, have a good meal, and everything's good. Like, let's be the cardboard cutouts in that circle and hold hands? Or does it mean like revolution, confronting racism and sexism and all that we're seeing, and confronting oppression and the actions of the people who are oppressing us, but reconciling with the people? Like, what is your definition of reconciliation?
exactly. Okay, Lucas. Go for it.
In 10 words or less, right? Well, so one thing, it's interesting. I mean, I think of it from the perspective of, I was talking to Mark about this yesterday. I think of A.J. Musty, right, who talked about revolutionary pacifism. Right? I mean, a lot of people try to make a distinction between pacifism and nonviolence, right, to kind of say that nonviolence activism is something different than pacifism, right? And the critique is that pacifism is a privileged position. Pacifism is something that you get to declare yourself when you don't have anything at stake. That's the critique, right? I reject that. Musty talked about a revolutionary pacifism, and that's why he was on the front lines in the labor movement, and that's why that's why FOR still has the respect that it does among labor organizers who know history. Again, that doesn't mean that we're present there anymore, but for those who know history, the respect is still there. So I guess part of what I'm saying is, I don't have the luxury of. I was involved in a conversation around the sexuality, this controversy within my denomination around sexuality, and I remember a guy met with me. I was leading a group of people that were in opposition to a particular position, and a guy met with me and he said, "You know, Lucas, a lot of us in leadership actually agree with you, but we just can't risk it right now." And I said. And my response is, and then he said to me, he says, think about, what Paul's verse about being, all things to all people for the sake of the gospel, and so on and so forth. And my response to that was to kind of say, well, here's the thing, and this is straight from Howard Thurman in many ways. I know where I am. Paul was a citizen of Rome. He got to sit at every table. He got to be invited to conversation. If Jesus is pushed into a ditch, Jesus is a Jew in a ditch, where Paul, as a citizen of Rome, can appeal to the Roman authority, right? So, in other words, I don't have the privilege of not being me. Like, I can't act in any conversation with people as if I don't also represent black men, right? As if I'm not also in prison. And so, I guess part of my response is to say, yes, reconciliation with the 1%, because they're people too, right? But at the time of social transformation, when we get to the world that we want to have, they're no longer 1% and we're no longer 99. And so in the meantime, I've got to speak from my social location. I've got to be where I am. And there's a difference between saying, what Occupy say. Occupy is not saying off with their heads, right? I mean, maybe. Yeah. Occupy is saying something different. It is struggling for something. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things I've really appreciated about Occupy, at least in Seattle, is that there is a black presence. Young, vital, very much. But what I've noted is that the black men and some of the women who are present aren't related to the black church. They're not part of it. And my suspicion is that the black church looks at Occupy and says, that's not our thing. That's not what we're involved in. I'm curious what your impression is of why, at least, I don't know if it's true across the country, but why the black church doesn't seem to be involved any more than it is, and why it doesn't see Occupy as something they should be involved in.
Thanks. Well, one thing, before I answer that, I just realized, I was kind of playing back my comments before in my head. When I was referencing Jesus' Jewish identity, what I meant to illustrate that is the social location that he was in during that time. And so I wanted to make sure that was clear. I wasn't. My answer to your question is that, one, I don't talk about the black church as a monolithic institution. I mean, I think there are black churches. Yes, there is a common experience, right? There are commonalities across the board. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I'll tell you briefly about my experience with Occupy Atlanta, right? This is and I'm going to be descriptive, right? I'm not trying to make a value judgment here. But in Atlanta, in my experience, it was very uncomfortable, right? For the Atlanta occupiers were all white for the most part, demonstrating against, in a city that's majority black, against black elected leadership, which they had access to. They had access. If they would have wanted to meet with the mayor, they could have met with the mayor. If they would have wanted to. Now, granted, I'm not saying that there's corporate interest, that there are not obviously there are, right? But then on top of that, for me, John Lewis came to speak to the occupiers in Atlanta, and they didn't let him speak. They didn't know who he was, right? And some people know, and many African Americans in the Occupy movement that were there, the few that were there, left. Right, and that was the end. Right? So until Occupy moved to start understanding the plight of people of color in Atlanta that were poor, that's when Occupy began to be more diverse, right, in Atlanta. But while it was just at Woodruff Park doing what they were doing, speaking from there, because for me it felt like it was really about reclaiming their own entitlement. At the time, right? It was about reclaiming their own entitlement. It wasn't about sort of social transformation in a broader sense. Now, again, it's much more complicated than that. It's much more complicated than that. And I don't mean to be, I don't want to be disparaging towards that. And I think that occupiers, in Atlanta, it's a much more, there are some people who ended up doing many dynamic and important things, and I'm glad that the Atlanta Occupy movement was there, and they're still there, and they're still doing good things. So I'm not trying to rain on the parade entirely. But that's one answer to your question. Specifically to the black church, I think you do have African American clergy, like pastors in churches and congregations that are speaking in favor of Occupy. But the perspective is a little bit different because they've been doing it already. They don't and just kind of say, many of these congregations, not all of them, they're not going to, what would be the appropriate thing be for them to do? Stop what they're doing so that they can go to Zuccotti Park or go to whatever. Is that what's necessary? Or is it, I think for many people it was like, great, reinforcements are here. Right?
5 minutes.
In Western Oregon, I think recent years, Islamophobia has probably been more of a problem. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's racism too.
All the answers.
He said in Western Oregon, Islamophobia is more of a problem. And I responded by saying, is that accurate? And he wanted me to comment on that, and I said, yeah, I think that's racism too. It's not only racism, right? But I kind of feel like it is. I kind of feel like it's just another. I'll tell you another, experience that I probably shouldn't say when people are recording me. But yeah, too late on. Yeah. But one of the most uncomfortable feelings that I had in 9/11, and I've talked to other people about this, and I'm not alone in this. One of the most uncomfortable feelings I had on 9/11 is that for the first time, I was walking down the street and white people felt safe with me. Right? I'm exaggerating a little bit. Obviously I can't, but and it was like, oh, we're one of them now. Like we're okay. Wow. That's wow. At least it's not us. You know? I mean, that's. I mean, so.
At least you're Christian. That's what.
Right. At least I'm Christian. At least I'm Christian. At least I'm fully assimilated into their Christian way of consumerism.
I don't want to become angry with the black community, and I don't want to blame the white community because I am from Spain.
Right.
And I feel in some occasions the discrimination at the black and the discrimination at the white. They don't accept me, not specifically me in some occasions, but talking about the foreign people, the strange people, the Spanish people. So when we are talking about reconciliation, I want to present the frame that reconciliation is not only white, North American, with black, African, whatever is the different colors. It's a challenge for all of us to construct a new world with different values, different parameters. So I agree with you, it's more complicated than this one.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right. I think you're right. It's much more complicated, and it is a fear of the other, right? I mean, it's on some level, and there's a lot wrapped up in it. But keep looking at the systemic racism. Keep looking at the history there, and I don't think it's that different in Spain. I've had my experiences.
Yeah, we can cut it.